Before I knew his name, I knew the weight of his silence. It was the first thing you learned working in the penthouse on the 72nd floor. Silence here was not an absence of sound. It was a presence, a physical entity with its own texture and density. The carpets were so thick they absorbed every footstep like a secret. The triple-paned glass erased the city below, turning its ceaseless roar into distant luminous abstraction, and at the center of that manufactured quiet was him, Kwon Ji-hoon. In those first months he was just Mr. Kwon, a name on an employment contract, a presence that altered the very air in a room. Rooms reorganized themselves around him. People didn't fall silent when he entered. The quality of their silence simply changed, becoming heavier, more attentive. My job was a ghost's work, perfectly suited to the life I was trying to build. Or rather, the life I was trying to unbuild. I was an archivist hired to catalog the contents of his library. It was a staggering collection of first editions, manuscripts, and forgotten histories bound in leather and regret. I spent my days in the quiet company of dead authors, my only tools a laptop, white cotton gloves, and a indices for being invisible. I arrived at 8, left at 5, and never saw him for more than a fleeting moment, a glimpse of a tailored suit jacket disappearing around a corner. The low murmur of his voice from the adjoining office, a sound that never rose in volume but commanded absolute authority. I learned the cadence of his footsteps, the specific click of his office door, the way the air pressure shifted just before he arrived on the floor. These were the metrics of my safety, the boundaries of my small, fiercely protected world. I told myself I was a scholar in a gilded cage, a temporary resident. I told myself I was fine. I knew even as I thought it that I was lying. There is a kind of fine that is really just a held breath, and I had been holding my breath for 2 years. His wife I saw more often, Soo-jin. She moved through the penthouse like a shard of ice, beautiful and sharp and cold. She wore her beauty like armor, her couture dresses like a warning. She never spoke to me, her eyes sliding over me as if I were a piece of the minimalist furniture. Her presence created a different kind of silence, a brittle, fragile one. When they were in the same room, the two silences would press against each other, a war of atmospheric pressures that was exhausting to witness. I would retreat deeper into my library, the scent of old paper a welcome shield. I learned to read the day's mood by the tension in the housekeeper Mrs. Song's shoulders, or by the way Mr. Choi, his silent right-hand man, stood by the elevator, his posture a study in grim readiness. Mr. Choi was a man made of straight lines and granite stillness. He communicated in nods, in glances, in the way he held his hands behind his back. He was the wall around Mr. Kwon's world, and I was just a small crack in the plaster, unnoticed. That was the arrangement. It was meant to be simple, but the thing about a deliberate, unhurried life is that you have too much time to notice the small things, and the small things I would learn were never small. It began 3 months into my employment, a Tuesday. I remember because I had been thinking about how Tuesdays are the most honest day of the week, devoid of the hope of Monday or the relief of Friday. I was cataloging a collection of Joseon-era astronomical charts, and I had mentioned, to no one in particular, to the air, to the books themselves, that the definitive modern text on the subject was nearly impossible to find. A limited print run in the 90s. I had said it aloud, a whisper into echoing silence of the library. That Friday, a flat, cardboard-wrapped parcel was on my desk. No note, just my tame Mina printed in a severe, blocky script. Inside was the book. Hardcover, pristine, smelling of new ink and old money. I stood there for a full 2 minutes, my hand hovering over the cover. It was an impossibility. I told myself it was a coincidence, a procurement error from the acquisitions department I didn't even know he had. It was a logical, sensible explanation, and it had the added benefit of not being terrifying. I placed the book on the corner of my desk and tried to ignore the way it seemed to watch me for the rest of the day. The following Monday, Mr. Kwon walked through the library, a rare occurrence. He paused, his gaze sweeping the shelves, and then it landed on the book on my desk. He didn't look at me. He just stopped for 2 seconds longer than the journey required. Then he moved on. The silence he left behind felt different. It felt knowing. I didn't touch the book for a week. The second time was a month later. A storm broke over the city, one of those violent autumn squalls that turn the sky a bruised gold. The rain came down in sheets, blurring the city lights into a watercolor wash. At 5 o'clock, I packed my bag, steeling myself for the long, wet walk to the subway. As I stepped out of the private elevator into the building's main lobby, a sleek black car was idling at the curb, rain sliding off its waxed hood. Mr. Choi stood by the door, holding an umbrella. He didn't speak, he just inclined his head toward the open rear door. I stopped. I am not a person who is driven. I am a person who stands on crowded trains, who tucks my chin into my scarf against the wind. There must be a mistake, I said. His expression didn't change. He simply waited. The unspoken message was clear. There are no mistakes. Getting into that car felt like a transgression, a line crossed. The leather seats were cool, the interior silent for the hypnotic rhythm of the wipers. I sat perfectly still, my hands clenched in my lap, and watched the rain-streaked city slide by. I was dropped at the corner of my street, not directly in front of my modest apartment building. A courtesy, a discretion, a clear sign that this was not a normal act of employer kindness. This was something else. I fled up the stairs to my apartment, my heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm. I told myself it was just efficiency. He couldn't have his archivist catching pneumonia. It was a matter of resource management. Both of those were true. Neither of them was the truth. The truth was that I felt seen. After 2 years of cultivating invisibility, it was the most terrifying feeling in the world. I counted the 11 minutes the car ride had taken, as if quantifying it could contain it. The third time sealed it. It was a small thing, almost nothing. I had a habit of buying a single gardenia from a flower stall near the subway every Monday morning. I would put it in a small bud vase on my desk. It was a private ritual, a small piece of beauty that belonged only to me in that sterile, perfect place. One Monday, I was running late. My friend Sarah had called from New York, a voice from my old life. A life of brunch and chaotic apartments and ordinary problems. The call had left me unsettled, a ghost of a person I no longer was. I skipped the flower stall. When I arrived at the library, flustered and breathless, there was a single perfect gardenia in the bud vase on my desk. It hadn't been there on Friday. Mrs. Song, the housekeeper, favored orchids. This was not her handiwork. There was only one other person who could have ordered it, one person whose quiet gaze missed nothing. Later that day, he passed the library entrance. He was on the phone, his voice that low, indecipherable murmur. But as he passed, his eyes met mine for a single shocking second, and I saw it. The thing I had only glimpsed before, a ghost of a muscular contraction around his mouth, an almost smile. It was there, and then it was gone before I could be certain I had seen it at all. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the flower. It was an acknowledgement. A piece of dialogue in a language I was only just beginning to understand. A language of quiet gestures and unnerving attention. I knew I should have been afraid. He was a man who moved in a world of shadows and violence, a world I had only read about in the grim thrillers that were ironically absent from his collection. But what I felt instead was a slow, creeping warmth like an ember finding dry wood. It was a dangerous feeling, and I, who had built my entire life around the avoidance of danger, did nothing to extinguish it. That was my first mistake. The quiet gestures continued, accumulating like dust motes in a sunbeam, invisible until they weren't. A new ergonomic chair appeared after he saw me rubbing my back one afternoon. A subtle adjustment to the library's temperature controls, making the room warmer on the days I wore a thin sweater. Each was deniable on its own, a series of fortunate coincidences. But together they formed a pattern, a narrative I was desperately trying not to read. I became a student of his movements, of the subtle shifts in the atmosphere that heralded his presence. I learned that the clink of ice in a glass from his office at 3 p.m. meant a deal had closed successfully. I learned that when he stood at the vast window overlooking the city for more than 5 minutes, his hands clasped behind his back, something was wrong. I was no longer just an archivist. I was a watcher, a silent observer in a one-way conversation. I never spoke to him. He never spoke to me. And yet we were communicating. I told myself I was simply being vigilant, a necessary skill in this environment. I told myself my hyper-awareness was a form of self-preservation. It was a lie I repeated every morning as I chose my plainest clothes, a lie I repeated every evening as I replayed the day's silences. The truth was, I was fascinated. I was drawn to the stillness in him, the immense, contained power that required no performance. He was like a force of nature, a deep ocean current beneath a placid surface. And I was drifting closer and closer to the pull. My phone calls with Sarah became a strange exercise in translation. "How's the job?" she'd ask, her voice crackling with the energy of a world away. Quiet, I'd say. The books are interesting. How could I explain that my boss had sent a car for me in the rain? How could I describe the weight of a glance? The unnerving intimacy an unsolicited flower? These were not currencies in her world. You sound different, Mina, she said once. Far away. I am far away, I thought, 72 floors away from everything I used to know. The distance felt both like a comfort and a profound loss. The penthouse was its own country, with its own language and its own immutable laws. Mr. Choi was its border patrol. Mrs. Song was its quiet, gentle citizen. Sujin was its beautiful, unhappy queen, and he was its silent, absolute sovereign. I saw Sujin more frequently that autumn. Her visits became longer, her presence more brittle. One afternoon she swept into the library, a cloud of expensive perfume and discontent. She ran a manicured finger along the spine of a priceless manuscript, her touch leaving a faint, oily smudge I would have to carefully clean. All these things, she said, her voice thin and sharp. She was speaking to the room, not to me. He prefers them to the living. Her gaze flickered to me then, dismissive and cold. Don't you find it lonely? The question was a barb, meant to wound. I looked at her, at the perfect unhappy mask of her face. I'm fine, I said, the words a shield I had used 1,000 times. She gave a short, mirthless laugh. That's what everyone in this house says. She turned and left, the sound of her heels on the marble floor like angry clicks. That was the day I understood she was not just unhappy, she was dangerous. A trapped animal is the most unpredictable. A week later, the first clear sign of external trouble appeared, though I didn't recognize it as such. Mr. Kwon issued a new protocol through Mr. Choi. For the next few weeks, Choi had said, his voice as flat as a blade, you will use the service elevator only. You will arrive at 8:30 and leave at 4:30, precisely. No explanation was offered. None was expected. It was an order disguised as a schedule change. I complied, of course. My small world shrank even further. The service corridors were windowless, painted a sterile white, the air tasting of ozone and disinfectant. It felt like moving through the building's arteries, hidden from view. I told myself it was for renovations, a security upgrade. Anything but the truth that was beginning to dawn on me. The walls were closing in. The silence in the penthouse grew heavier, denser. It was no longer just attentive, it was tense, strained. I could feel it in the way Mr. Choi now stood outside the library doors, not just by the elevator, in the way the shades were always drawn. One afternoon, a woman I had never seen before arrived, an art dealer from Geneva, all sharp angles and sharper intelligence. She and Mr. Kwon spoke in his office for an hour. As she was leaving, escorted by Choi, she passed the library. She paused, and her intelligent eyes met mine. She took in my plain gray dress, the book in my hands, the single gardenia in its vase. She looked from me to the closed door of his office. A slow, snowing smile touched her lips. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement between two women who understood things without needing them said. It was a confirmation. I was not invisible, and my presence here was, for some reason, significant. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me. Invisibility had been my armor. Now I felt I was standing in the center of a room with no armor at all. The day before everything changed, I found a small carved wooden bird on my desk, nestled beside the vase. It was simple, almost crude, but the lines were confident. It was a shorebird, its head cocked as if listening for the tide. It was the most personal gesture yet. There was no way to rationalize it, no way to pretend it was a coincidence. It was a gift, a message. I closed my hand around it, the wood smooth and warm against my palm. I should have run. I should have packed my single bag, walked out the service elevator, and never looked back. I should have disappeared back into the anonymous flow of the city. I know this now, but I didn't. I stayed. I put the bird in my pocket. And I waited. The night he fell, the air was thick with unspoken words, heavy as unshed rain. I was not supposed to be there. The new protocol dictated I leave at 4:30. Precisely. But a shipment of rare maps had arrived, fragile vellum crying out for a climate-controlled environment, and I had stayed, losing myself in the delicate ink lines of coastlines that no longer existed. I told myself it was diligence. I told myself the maps were too valuable to leave overnight. The truth was, the thought of my small, empty apartment was less compelling than the charged silence of the penthouse. The silence was different that evening. It was hollow, empty. Mrs. Song had gone home. Mr. Choi was not at his usual post. The building felt like a lung that had just exhaled. I knew he was there. I could feel his presence on the floor above in his private quarters. I had heard the elevator sigh its arrival hours ago, but the usual low murmur of his voice, the clink of glass, the soft footfalls, all were absent. There was only the hum of the ventilation and the frantic beat of my own heart. It was 8:17 p.m. I counted the seconds. The first sound was a muffled thud from the floor above, not loud, the kind of sound you could dismiss as the building settling. But in that absolute quiet, it was a gunshot. I froze, my hand flat on a 16th century map of the Korean peninsula. Then another sound, sharper this time, the splintering of wood. My training, my 2 years of self-imposed discipline to be small and silent and invisible, screamed at me to stay put, hide, disappear into the stacks and wait for morning. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. I have thought about that decision many times since. The moment when I stood up. The moment I walked out of the library, my footsteps swallowed by the carpet. The moment I chose to walk toward the danger instead of away from it. There is a point, I know this now, when you stop falling and start choosing. I was choosing. The main living area was dark, the floor-to-ceiling windows showing a city of indifferent, glittering lights. The door to the private staircase that led to his quarters was slightly ajar. A sliver of bruised gold light spilled onto the marble floor. I pushed it open. The silence that met me was absolute, terrifying. It was not the weighted silence of his presence. It was the empty silence of his absence. I climbed the stairs, my hand gripping the cold metal railing. Each step was a deliberate act of will. The upper floor was a scene of quiet devastation. An overturned table, a shattered vase, its water pooling on the dark wood floor, orchids scattered like fallen soldiers, and across the room, slumped in a chair near the window, was him. He was in his shirt sleeves, the white fabric a stark contrast to the spreading darkness on his side. His head was bowed, his hands pressed against his ribs. For a moment I thought he was dead. The silence in the room was that profound, that final. Then his head lifted, slowly, as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. His eyes found me in the dim light. They were dark, clouded with pain, but they were lucid. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look alarmed. He just looked at me, a long, searching gaze that held the entire history of the last 6 months. Then he spoke, his voice a raw whisper, barely audible. You came. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a truth he had somehow known. I walked toward him, my feet moving as if in a dream. The shattered glass crunched under my shoes, the only sound in the room. I knelt before him, my gaze fixed on the dark stain blooming on his shirt. Are you hurt? I asked, the words clumsy and inadequate. He didn't answer. His eyes were on my face. His wife Soo-jin was gone. Her closet, visible through an open door, was empty, a few stray hangers askew on the rail. Her perfume was a ghost in the air. The betrayal was a palpable thing in the room, a second wound. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the edge of his sleeve. The fabric was damp. He flinched, a small, sharp intake of breath. I'm fine, I whispered, the reflexive words tasting like a lie. It was what I always said. But this time, it felt like a promise. For the first time, I was the one holding the silence. I was the only one there to hold it. The silence after my whispered, reflexive I'm fine, stretched into a universe. He held my gaze, and in the depths of his eyes I saw not the powerful, untouchable man from the library, but something raw and stripped away. The pain was there, yes, but beneath it was a flicker of something else. Resignation. And a startling, unnerving vulnerability. The entire penthouse, his fortress in the sky, felt violated and fragile. The city lights outside seemed to mock the wreckage within. My own fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, unfamiliar surge of purpose. My carefully constructed world of invisibility had shattered, and in its place, something else was taking root. The sound of the private elevator ascending was a sudden, sharp intrusion. I stiffened, my hand still near his arm. His eyes flickered toward the sound, a spark of the old command momentarily returning. But he didn't move. He was watching my face, gauging my reaction. The doors slid open and Mr. Choi stepped out. He took in the scene in a single sweeping slice, the overturned furniture, the shattered glass, me kneeling on the floor, and finally his boss, bleeding in the chair. His granite face showed nothing, but his movements were electric with urgency. He had a medical kit in one hand and a phone pressed to his ear. Secure the perimeter. Level 3 lockdown, no one in or out. He spoke into the phone, his voice a low, lethal hum. Then he hung up and was across the room in 3 long strides. He knelt beside me, his presence a solid wall of grim competence. Sir, he said. His voice respectful but firm. He began cutting away the fabric of Mr. Kwon's shirt with a pair of trauma shears from the kit. The wound was on his side, a deep, ugly gash just below the ribs. It was bleeding sluggishly, the dark blood stark against his pale skin. Near his wrist, where the cuff was now torn, I saw it clearly for the first time, a faint, silvery scar, an old wound shaped like a crescent moon, now bisected by the fresh trauma. My breath hitched. He had been hurt before. This world of violence was not new to him. This was just the latest chapter. Mr. Kwon's gaze was still on me. It was as if Choi wasn't even there, as if the only two people in this ruined room were him and me. Choi said, his voice pulling me from the strange trance. It was the first time he had ever used my name. I need you to hold this. He pressed a thick gauze pad into my hand and guided it to the wound. Press hard. Don't let up. My hands were trembling, but I did as he said. The warmth of the blood soaked through the gauze almost instantly. I pressed down, the intimate, terrible reality of the moment searing itself into my memory. Under my hands, I could feel the slight tremor that ran through Mr. Kwon's body. He didn't make a sound. The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. Choi worked with a terrifying efficiency, cleaning and dressing the wound, administering a painkiller that made Mr. Kwon's eyes glaze over slightly, though he never lost consciousness. He just watched me. His gaze was a physical weight. Choi made a series of terse phone calls, his words clipped and coded. The package is compromised. Asset has been liquidated. Find her. The last was delivered with a cold fury that chilled me to the bone. He was talking about Sujin. The betrayal was complete. We have to move, Choi announced, snapping his phone shut. This location is no longer secure. He helped Mr. Kwon to his feet. The man was unsteady, leaning heavily on his silent protector, but his spine was straight. He refused to show the full extent of his weakness. As they moved toward the elevator, he paused and looked back at me. I was still kneeling on the floor, my hands stained with his blood. I must have looked like a frightened ghost. Come, Choi said to me. It wasn't a question or a request, it was a command. I got to my feet, my legs unsteady. I left my bag, my books, my entire former life behind in that library. The only thing I took was the small wooden bird in my pocket. The ride down in the service elevator was a descent into a new reality. The three of us were packed into the small metal box, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and blood. I stood pressed against the wall, trying to make myself small again, but it was useless. I was part of this now. I was in the eye of the storm. I kept counting. 12 floors, 25 floors, 40 floors. The numbers were a fragile anchor in a world that had come unmoored. Mr. Kwon was leaning against the opposite wall, his eyes closed now, his face pale and etched with pain, but I could feel him watching me through his closed lids. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the elevator's descent. We exited into a subterranean parking garage, a cavern of concrete and shadows. A different black car was waiting, its engine a low thrum. Choi eased Mr. Kwon into the back seat and then looked at me, his gaze unreadable. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. This was the last chance, the last moment I could turn and run, melt back into the city, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But my feet moved toward the open car door. I slid in, the door closing behind me with a solid, final thud. The car pulled out into the night, leaving the glittering tower behind. I didn't look back. There was nothing to look back to. My old life was gone. My new one was a question mark, sitting beside a bleeding, silent man who had, for some inexplicable reason, noticed me. The safe house was a place of ghosts. It was a modern, sterile apartment in a nondescript building somewhere in the city's anonymous sprawl. It had the feeling of a place that was never truly lived in, only occupied. The furniture was expensive but impersonal, the art on the walls chosen to offend no one. It smelled of fresh paint and disuse. Choi settled Mr. Kwon on a low sofa in the living room, the city lights a distant, fractured grid through the blinds. Then he turned to me. There is a bedroom through there, he said, gesturing down a short hallway. Food in the fridge. Do not leave. Do not open the door for anyone but me. Do not use the phone. Is that understood? I nodded, my throat tight to speak. He looked at me for a moment longer, a flicker of something, assessment, maybe even a sliver of pity in his dark eyes. Then he was gone, the door locking behind him with a series of metallic clicks that sounded like a prison sentence, and then we were alone. The silence that descended was different from any I had known before. It was not the weighted silence of power, nor the brittle silence of tension. This was a fragile, shared silence, spun between two people adrift in the wreckage of a life. He was on the sofa, his head tipped back against the cushions, his breathing shallow. I stood in the middle of the room, feeling useless and exposed. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a tremor in my hands I couldn't stop. I went into the small, immaculate kitchen and found a glass. My hands were shaking so badly that the glass rattled against the faucet as I filled it with water. I carried it back into the living room and set it on the table beside him. He didn't open his eyes, but he spoke, his voice rough. "Thank you." 2 words. More than he had said to me in 6 months. I retreated to the other side of the room, curling into an armchair that felt too big, and watched him. Hours passed, the city outside quieted. The sky began to pale from black to a deep bruised indigo. He drifted in and out of a shallow pain-laced sleep. Sometimes he would murmur something in Korean, his brow furrowed. I didn't move. I just watched over him. It was the only thing I could think to do. Sometime before dawn, a fever took hold. A fine sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead, and a tremor ran through his body that had nothing to do with weakness. He was shivering. I went to the bedroom Choi had indicated and found a single neatly folded blanket in the closet. It was soft gray cashmere. I brought it out and gently draped it over him. My fingers brushed against his neck, and the heat radiating from his skin was alarming. He needed a doctor. He needed a hospital. But I knew that was an impossibility. Choi was his doctor. This sterile apartment was his hospital. I found a cloth in the bathroom, soaked it in cool water, and returned to his side. I hesitated for only a second before gently placing the damp cloth on his forehead. He sighed, a low sound of relief, and his body seemed to relax slightly. His eyes fluttered open. They were fever-bright, but they were focused on me. He looked at me for a long time, at my tired face, my blood-stained hands, which I had forgotten to wash. Then he lifted his own hand, the one that wasn't pressed to his side, and slowly, deliberately, reached for me. My heart stopped. I was certain he was going to push me away, to re-establish the boundary I had so thoroughly crossed. Instead, his fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed against my cheek. A single, feather-light touch. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. The directness of the question, from a man who only ever spoke in implications, was a shock. I looked into his dark, feverish eyes and gave him the only thing I had left to give. "The truth. Yes," I said, my own voice barely audible, "but I'm still here." A ghost of that almost smile touched his lips, more real this time, more weary. "I know," he said. Then his eyes drifted shut and he fell into a deeper, more natural sleep. I sat on the floor beside the sofa, my back against the cushions, and for the first time that night I let my own eyes close. I didn't sleep. I just listened to the sound of his breathing, a steady rhythm in the quiet dark. It was the only sound in the world. The days that followed blurred into a slow, suspended rhythm of care and silence. 6 days of silence I counted, Mr. Choi came and went like a phantom, his arrivals and departures marked only by the click of the locks. He would bring groceries, fresh medical supplies, and terse single-word updates for his boss. Contained, located, handled. Each word was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of our confinement, the ripples spreading and then disappearing. He never acknowledged my role directly, but he started bringing 2 coffee cups instead of 1. It was his version of a conversation, Mrs. Song appeared on the 3rd day, a small, anxious bird of a woman carrying bags of homemade soup and rice. She fussed over Mr. Kwon, her gentle scolding in Korean a soft counterpoint to Choi's brutal efficiency. She looked at me with worried, knowing eyes and pressed a warm container of barley tea into my hands before she left. "You must eat," she whispered, and it felt like a blessing. My world shrank to the 4 walls of that apartment, to the task of tending to him. I changed his dressings. I made sure he took the antibiotics Choi left. I coaxed him to eat Mrs. Song's soup. We barely spoke, there was no need. We had moved beyond words into a language of proximity and shared breath. I would read in the armchair across from him, the pages of a worn paperback I'd found on a shelf, turning silently. He would watch me, his gaze intent, contemplative. The power dynamic had inverted. In the penthouse he had been the watcher and I the watched. Here, in this sterile box, we were equals in our observation. He was healing, the color was returning to his face, the sharp lines of pain around his eyes softening. The fever broke on the 4th day, the wound began to close, but as his physical strength returned, a different kind of tension began to build in the room. The fragile peace of the sick room was ending. A new, uncertain chapter was beginning. He was sitting by the window, staring out at the gray, indifferent city, when the turning point came. It was the evening of the sixth day. Rain was streaking down the glass, distorting the lights into long, shimmering tears. He had been silent for hours. I was in the kitchen, washing the few dishes we used, when I felt his presence behind me. I turned and he was standing in the doorway, blocking the light. He was dressed in a clean black t-shirt and gray sweatpants Choi had brought, his arm no longer in a sling. He looked almost like himself again, the coiled stillness back in his posture. But his eyes were different. The opaque shield was gone. "I spoke to Choi," he said. His voice was stronger now, the familiar low cadence returned. I just nodded, my hands still in the warm, soapy water. "The threat is neutralized," he stated. It was a flat declaration, devoid of emotion, but the finality of it hung in the air, handled. Sujin was a ghost now, a problem that had been erased. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. This was his world, a world where people could be neutralized. He took a step into the kitchen. It was a small room, and his presence immediately filled it. He was too close. I could feel the heat from his body, smell the clean scent of soap. I turned back to the sink, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat. I told myself to be calm. I told myself this was the end of the interlude. Soon Choi would come and take him back to a new penthouse, a new fortress, and I would be given a severance check and a warning to forget everything I had seen. But he didn't leave. He just stood there, watching me. The silence stretched, becoming so dense I could barely breathe. I finished the last plate and reached for a towel. His hand shot out, not touching me, but hovering just over my arm. I froze. "Mina," he said. It was the second time he had said my name, but this time it was different. It was not a label, it was a sound he had shaped with intention. I slowly turned to face him. He was closer than I'd realized. I had to tilt my head back to meet his gaze. The amber light from the small kitchen fixture caught in his dark eyes. He looked down at me, his expression unreadable but intense, and then he did the one thing I could never have anticipated. He lifted his hand, the one with the crescent-shaped scar, and gently, so gently, tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers brushed against my temple, a touch that was both fleeting and electric. It was a gesture of such startling tenderness that it broke through every wall I had ever built. A tremor went through me. My breath caught in my throat. I had survived his power, his silence, his violence. I was not sure I could survive his tenderness. "Ji-hoon," I whispered. The name felt foreign and forbidden on my tongue. It was a line crossed, a threshold breached. I had named the god. I had named the storm. The silence that followed was the most profound yet. It was not empty, not tense, not fragile. It was full. It held everything. His almost smile appeared, and this time it stayed. It was small, just a faint upward curve of his lips, but it transformed his face, erasing the last of the shadows. "Choi can take you anywhere," he said, his voice low and steady. "A new name, a new life. Far from all this, you would be safe." He was offering me an escape, a clean slate. The thing I thought I wanted more than anything. I looked into his eyes and saw the cost of the offer. He was offering to let me go. I thought of my old life, the one Sarah still lived, a life of noise and casual connections and predictable days. I thought of the 2 years I had spent cultivating my own silence, my own smallness, hiding from the ghosts of a past that had taught me to trust no one, least of all myself. I had come to this man's world seeking invisibility, a place to disappear, and instead I had been found. He was offering me freedom, but the cage he described, a new, anonymous life, sounded exactly like the one I had just escaped. The true cage was not his world, it was the fear that had kept me in my own. To leave now would not be an act of self-preservation. It would be an act of cowardice. It would be a betrayal of the person I was becoming, the one who had walked up that staircase. He was watching me, his gaze steady, waiting for my answer. The choice was mine. This was the core of it. He was not trying to keep me, to possess me, to handle me. He was giving me the one thing no one else ever had, a choice, with my eyes wide open. His world was dangerous and shadowed. His hands were not clean, I knew that. I had washed his blood from them myself. But in his world, I was not invisible, I was seen, I was real. I took a breath, a real one, not the shallow, held breath of my former life. "And if I don't want to go anywhere?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. "If I want to stay," the almost smile on his face didn't widen, but a new light came into his eyes, a warmth that seemed to start deep inside him and spread outward. He didn't speak for a long moment. He just looked at me, and in that look, I saw the future. Not an easy future, not a simple one, but a chosen one. He lifted his hand again, but this time he didn't stop at my hair. He cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking softly along my cheekbone. The gesture was possessive and tender all at once. It was an anchor. Mine, he said, the word a low rumble in his chest. If you choose it. Just that, a statement of fact, a declaration, not a cage but a harbor. I leaned into his touch, a silent surrender that was the bravest thing I had ever done. I choose it, I said, and in the quiet of that sterile kitchen, with the rain still falling outside, it felt like coming home. 3 weeks passed. The world outside the safes began to reassert itself, but it was a different world now, or perhaps I was just seeing it through a different lens. Mr. Choi's visits became less about tactical updates and more about logistics. Quiet discussions with Ji-hoon in the corner of the room, documents signed, arrangements made. I did not ask. I did not need to. I understood my place was not in the mechanics of his empire, but at its still center. I was the keeper of the quiet now. During this time, he never left the apartment. He was a king in a self-imposed, temporary exile, rebuilding his kingdom through encrypted phone calls and Choi's unwavering loyalty. And I was there. I made coffee in the morning. I found a small grocery that delivered, and I started to cook, filling the sterile apartment with the scent of garlic and ginger, scents of life. We ate our meals at the small dining table, the silence between us was no longer a void to be endured but a space to be shared. It was comfortable, easy. Sometimes he would watch me as I read, a small contemplative smile still on his face. Sometimes I would look up and find his gaze on me, and I would simply hold it, no fear, no flinching. The balance had shifted permanently. We were two solitudes, protecting each other. One evening, he came to stand behind me as I was looking out the window at the sprawling city. He didn't touch me, but I could feel his presence, a familiar warmth at my back. That tower, he said, his voice low, and I followed his gaze to the glittering spire of his former penthouse, a distant needle of light. It was a fortress. It was designed to be impenetrable. I waited. Sujin knew its weaknesses, he continued, his tone flat, analytical. She sold them. It was a simple business transaction for her, an exchange of assets. He spoke of the betrayal as if it were a failed merger, but I could hear the faint, underlying tremor of something deeper. Not heartbreak. Something colder, the violation of a fundamental code. I built it to keep the world out, he said, more to himself than to me. I never considered the threat was